History is not so much a review of the past as it is looking at one's heritage. Heritage is an awareness of how we came to be who we are and what we have become. Hello, my name is Jeff Freimeyer, and it is my privilege to be the senior pastor here at First Church of God in Fresno. Our church has a long and distinguished heritage, and if you consider this to be your church home, then this is your heritage as well. 100 years ago, California was a boom state. Aided by the gold rush of 1849, the United States was moving westward during the latter part of the 19th century. Fresno was a small farming community full of groves and acres of crops. It was still a Wild West town, populated by more saloons than churches. But that was about to change. Down on Kern and L Streets, people began to notice the erection of a tent and the announcement of a revival meeting. Such notices were community events that would draw crowds from around the city and countryside. The evangelists were well-known Church of God men who had migrated from the Midwest, J.L. Byers and Jeremiah Cole. The year was 1898, and the revival would spawn a small but significant church in Fresno. They would take the simple name Church of God. Years ago, for nearly a decade, the church would bounce around, first from a hall on Tulare Street, eventually to one at Mariposa and N. Then finally, their first church building would be located here at the corner of Park and Belmont, actually on the northwest corner. It's now an empty lot, and here I am standing under an overpass for the 180 Gap. Around the time of World War I, the church would move from this facility a few blocks across to the corner of Washington and Howard. That would become their permanent facility for the next 4 decades. Years ago, this corner here at Washington and Howard was home for First Church of God. As a matter of fact, many of those who attend our congregation today began their journey with the Lord right here on this corner. Under the guidance of Pastor C.H. Beam, who would pastor this church for nearly 2 decades, the church took root here and it grew. Today, it's an apartment building, but 60 years ago, it was our home.
Let me introduce you to Catherine Mansky. For more than 55 years, Catherine has been part of the congregation here at First Church of God. But like many of our families here at the church, for more than 20 years before that, she spent time worshiping in the German Church of God. Catherine, tell us, what made you change from the German-speaking Church of God to the English-speaking Church of God?
Well, my daughter was about 14, and the pastor's daughter was just the same age, and they sat in the back and just write notes and giggle. So I felt like she needed more spiritual food than that. So I talked to the pastor and asked him if he would mind if I would go to the English congregation. And he said, no, that by all means to go ahead. He had already resigned. So then we went to the English congregation. It was in the summertime, and there was no one there that I knew. I knew a number of people there, but they had all gone to camp meeting in Reedley. So, but we kept on coming, and we've enjoyed it a lot.
The church began to grow and develop significantly after moving to this location. New families, new growth, and bulging needs stretched the facility to breaking points. Growth causes change, and First Church was changing. Like a growing child, First Church needed to expand. Now, back in the 1940s, the facility needed to stretch. Congregations sacrificed and came up with the money, in hard times, mind you, to make the expansion a reality. Tragedy would strike early one day in March of 1957. The building that had housed the congregation for nearly 40 years caught fire on the afternoon of March 22nd and burned to the ground.
The old English congregation burned. and we had no choice. We had to move someplace else, so we went to the YMCA for a long time until we found this Pastor Shrout.
On the north edge of Fresno, there lay an orchard. Out beyond where the town of Fresno had grown, there was a plot of land that the leadership of First Church believed in their hearts was the place where God was leading them. Now, this was a bold move, but that move would place the church on the leading edge of the new growth of the booming town of Fresno. And on May 18th, 1958, ground was broken in that orchard and a new church was begun. 1 year after the groundbreaking of the church, the congregation would move from its temporary facilities at the YWCA, and on May 24th, 1959, they would come here to what they called the temporary fellowship hall of the church. Now, some years later, they changed this into a series of classrooms for the church to use. But now, finally, the task was underway. For 2 years, the church worked and planned. Buildings began to take shape, first one small section, then another. In the process, the church not only committed itself to raising the funds, they also committed themselves to doing the work. Volunteer labor would save the church nearly 1/4 of the total cost of the building. Many of those who participated in the construction of the building still recall the putting into place of the stained glass window or the sanding of the boards in the sanctuary ceiling. Finally, in May of 1960, First Church of God in Fresno held its first service at the corner of First and Saginaw. However, it would be another year before things were completed enough to have a grand dedication service. What a grand service it was. The sanctuary was full as folks from all over came to help us celebrate this great homecoming. It was the culmination of a long and rewarding process. Leading the church through this process was Reverend Erwin Shrout. For a quarter of a century, he would lead this congregation through its most impressive years of growth and establishment. The Kerner family took the job of coordinating all the work and labor that was done on the building. Wes Kerner, along with his father Carl and his brother Melvin, were the general contractors for the building of the church at First in Saginaw.
You know, as I stand here in this sanctuary and look around at the walls, they all have a very special meaning to me, because as we were during construction, I can remember the cross as being a very meaningful time. When we were about to erect the cross, it was difficult to get any scaffolding or type of equipment in here to raise the cross. So my dad, being a very agile man at that time, decided that the best thing to do was just to put a ladder up and see if he couldn't carry the cross up by himself. So he started up the ladder, and in the process received quite a severe laceration in his arm. Not knowing this, he continued on and hung the cross in its saddles, and then came down and stopped and looked back at the cross and noticed the blood dripping down from the cross. And this was a very, very special time for my dad, because he looked, and Pastor Shrout was there at that time and said, "You know, Carl, this is just like the blood that Christ shed." And it was a very emotional and meaning time. I look at the sanctuary, and the beams, as they arch up to the sky, is supposed to reflect and cause your eyes to look up to the heavens. And as you look up towards the heavens, then your eyes would reflect over and look at the cross, the real meaning that we are here to worship. And after a worship service, you would turn around in the sanctuary, and your eyes would then focus on this gigantic, large window at the back of the sanctuary with the many, many different colors of glass, reflecting the magnificence of God, the Creator. And they're a very interesting story about the window. If you'll notice at the upper portion, there's a number of red blocks in one particular area. A group of ladies decided to go down and view what the artist was doing on this, in creating this window, and said, well, you haven't used very many red blocks. So he started using more red. Now, he was an artist and he was creating, but he listened to what the ladies said. The window weighs over 11 tons and is supposed to be the focal point of the sanctuary, the massive, magnificent structure which represents God. On this side here, the east side, you'll notice the different opaque colors of glass, and dividing the glass is little crosses, which is to remind you of another reason why we are in here worshiping God. And then on the west side of the sanctuary, you'll notice a large glass panel, and on the exterior we have these large, massive concrete louvers. The idea here was that you would be able to look out and see the magnificence of God's creation. And louvers were to be placed in such a manner that no sunlight would ever be allowed to come into the sanctuary, but leave it to man and his imperfection, is being an imperfect person. The louvers were placed just 3 or 4 degrees in the wrong position, and so at a certain time of the year sunlight does come in, and I often chuckle when I see that sunlight come in.
As First Church entered the last quarter of the 20th century, we did so with new pastoral leadership, but with an exciting vision and with an expanding focus. Outreach became an important part of what we do, and that included the vision for a preschool center. Not only for a preschool center, but we also had a vision for a Christian elementary school. Today, between these two ministries, First Church ministers to more than 270 children every day of the week. Today, First Church Christian Academy is the second largest Christian elementary school in the entire city of Fresno. Isn't that right, kids? First Church is now a bustling congregation of exciting worship, dynamic small groups, a thriving youth ministry, ministries to both children and senior adults, fabulous musicals, and an emphasis on growth and continuing the vision that was established through our heritage. We have entered a new phase in our growth and development as we begin to look again toward a vision for the future.
As we look forward to a new millennium and a new century for First Church of God, the future does indeed seem bright.
The Lord and the church has been my life. And the children and I always went to church. My husband didn't go, but children and I always went to church. And it will be a spiritual church. You can find a lot of other things in other places, but you can only find the true worship and the true Lord in the church, and I hope we'll always find it there.
A successful capital campaign has begun a refurbishing of our current facility.
When God's involved, all things are possible.
First Church Christian Center is recording record growth for the coming school year. Our youth and children's ministries are at an all-time high. Worship is exciting and meaningful for this 300-member congregation.
All the programs of this church are designed for excellence. The children's programs, the youth programs, the worship services, the small groups, even the school that meets here.
We are sharing the gospel with others through evangelism explosion training. Our missionary arm reaches out from Fresno to Africa to the Middle East.
I'm just excited about what the Lord has in store for us here at First Church.
Dozens of small group home Bible studies engage members of the congregation on a weekly basis. First Church is moving forward, because we have had such a great heritage to celebrate.
I'm so glad our church has a vision for the future. We have placed a priority in education here in this facility. We have placed children at the top of that list. And this will allow us to grow and to increase our numbers so that we can touch other families for Jesus Christ through an abundance of ministries, through Sunday school, through worship service, through the school and the preschool. What a great opportunity we have for the future.
For all these reasons, and for others that God has yet to reveal, First Church of God in Fresno is able to begin its second century building on the past to create a new future.